Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to objectively unpack a massive tectonic shift that is quite literally shaking the foundation of Australian politics. Right now, there's a fierce and really fascinating battle taking place, and it's a fight for the political right. We're going to dive deep into the data, look at shifting voter sentiments, and explore the incredibly complex strategic dilemmas facing conservative parties. We'll be using the source material to map out exactly how this realignment is unfolding, and most importantly, what it means for the future of the country's governance. Let's get into it.
To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this fracture, we have to zoom out and look at history for a second. Observers and political analysts in our source material are describing this as a truly historic shift. In fact, they're comparing its impact to the momentous Labour Party split way back in the 1950s. To truly understand what's happening today, you kind of have to imagine it as a political road trip, very similar to exploring the populist surge we saw during Trump's America. This isn't just a tiny blip in the polls. We are looking at a fundamental change in how a massive block of the electorate is choosing to engage with conservative politics.
Okay, let's zoom in and look at this on a personal level. Meet Colin. He's a Baptist minister and, by his own admission, a former left-leaning voter. Colin represents a really critical demographic in this shifting landscape. Recently, he and his wife sat down with a very specific analytical goal. They decided to go through exactly what all the major political parties were saying right now, policy by policy, just to see which one actually aligned with their current personal values. They totally stripped away the branding and just looked at the raw stances on the issues that mattered to them.
Well, what happened next was a pretty huge political awakening for Colin. He actually turned to his wife and said, "This is a bit disturbing." You realize the answer is one nation. Now, why did he call it disturbing? Because for years, he'd perceived Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party as radical or out on the fringe. But when he looked at the cold, hard policy stances today, he realized that this populist party directly represented his current views on the direction the country should take.
So what's actually driving this shift? Honestly, it boils down to one word: consistency. The primary reason voters like Colin are abandoning the traditional coalition for One Nation is a stark contrast in political consistency over the last 30 years. On one hand, you have One Nation, characterized by unwavering consistency on their core issues. On the other hand, you have the coalition, which these voters perceive as trying to have a bob each way, basically flip-flopping and changing their stances depending on which way the political wind is blowing.
And this inconsistency has created a massive trust deficit for the mainstream right. Even senior liberal figures, like Angus Taylor, openly admit they've lost voter trust by wavering on a few critical fronts. In the eyes of this frustrated voter base, the coalition gets heavily criticized for softening on immigration, flip-flopping on net zero emissions, supporting it and then opposing it, and for waxing and waning on various social or so-called woke agendas, especially when leadership changes. For a conservative voter looking for a firm anchor, this constant shifting is incredibly frustrating.
Meanwhile, when those frustrated voters look over at Pauline Hanson, they see something completely different. They observe that she has maintained her exact same stances on these specific issues, like immigration and economic nationalism, for 3 whole decades. To her supporters, she's basically a political rock. What is absolutely crucial to understand here is that these voters are largely unaffected by the daily political scandals or the misspeak of the moment that the media tends to focus on. They value 30 years of policy consistency way above day-to-day political theater.
So, the coalition has a really profound problem on its hands. Sure, the Liberals are attempting to pivot right now, hardening their stances on immigration and net zero once again to win back these voters. But rebuilding broken trust with the electorate is a daunting, massive uphill battle. As the source material points out, it's just like a personal relationship. You can break trust very easily, but it takes a long, long time to win it back. And for a significant portion of these voters, they've already made up their minds to park their vote with One Nation.
But, hey, we need to zoom out again and look at the broader electoral math, because this internal fight on the right isn't happening in a vacuum. Despite this fierce right-wing battle and the massive surge in populist support, the overall numbers paint a pretty daunting picture for conservatives. Across the board, the center-left Labour Party still holds a commanding 55 to 45 two-party preferred lead. That number has remained stubbornly consistent, and it looks very much like the results we saw back in the 2022 election.
To put that into perspective, Labour isn't just scraping by. That 55-45 split translates to Labour sitting very comfortably with over 90 seats in Parliament. Just as a reminder, you only need 76 seats to govern. This means the right side of politics isn't just trying to figure out its own identity, it's trying to figure it out while sitting deeply in opposition against a heavily entrenched government.
So this brings up a sweeping, massive strategic question. How on earth does the political right win back the mainstream electorate?
For the coalition to ever govern again, they have to do much more than just fight one nation for the conservative base. They can't just change the minds of people who already lean right, they critically need to change the minds of voters who previously endorsed Labor. And to do that, they have to offer something highly compelling.
Well, according to the analysts in our source material, that compelling offer has to be economic hope. Some liberal voices are arguing that the only real path forward is deep, medium to long-term economic reform. We're talking about pitching bold solutions to the cost of living and interest rates. The proposed strategy involves heavily cutting government spending to put downward pressure on interest rates and entirely abandoning the net zero framework. The theory there is that this would drive down electricity prices, which would then flow through to lower costs for manufacturing and everyday goods.
But, and this is a huge but, there is a major catch here: the political cost. Slashing government spending means taking money away from places that currently rely on it, which is going to instantly infuriate unions and hand a ton of ammunition over to the Labor Party. These kinds of necessary, structural, economic reforms are incredibly difficult to sell to a broad public that is looking for quick, immediate relief. So promising these deep cuts won't necessarily deliver an instant victory at the ballot box. It's very much a long-term play in a short-term political cycle.
This whole situation perfectly illustrates the asymmetrical warfare happening on the right. One nation has a much easier job, right? Their strategy is simply to capture the protest vote. They just have to stand up and say, reject the major parties. But the danger for the coalition is existential. One nation can hoover up these protest votes and potentially destroy the coalition's base by taking traditional national and liberal seats, all without taking a single seat away from Labor. The coalition just gets knocked sideways while the left remains firmly in power.
Okay, let's step out of the theoretical for a second and see how this builds into real-world consequences. The ultimate test for this shifting dynamic isn't just polling data. It's happening right now with the ballot box. Our source points directly to the Victorian state election as the immediate bellwether for the future of the Australian political right. What happens here is going to strongly signal how the federal landscape will look over the coming years.
Analysts break this upcoming test down into two clear potential outcomes. On one hand, if the coalition manages to win the election outright in their own right, it sends a really strong signal that the one-nation surge might have finally peaked and the traditional right is consolidating. But on the other hand, if they are forced to rely on one-nation seats just to form a minority government, then the writing is on the wall. It signals that this populist wave is absolutely not a blip, and it's here for the foreseeable future.
And for those of you who love digging into the polling data, there's one more critical number to keep in your head: 15. Because even if one nation's current high tide of support recedes and drops down to just 15%, they still wield extraordinary power. In the Australian system, a 15% primary vote essentially guarantees one nation a senator in every single state. This ensures they're going to remain a powerful, entrenched force in the upper house, regardless of minor fluctuations in their day-to-day popularity.
Which leaves us with one final provocative question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. As this fight for the right gets more and more intense, is this just a passing phase of voter frustration driven by tough economic times? Or are we actually witnessing the new, permanent reality of a deeply fractured Australian political landscape? Keep a close eye on those upcoming state elections, because the answer to that question is going to reshape the country's governance for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.